that means they go up in the ocean as well, causing some issues there. And then as we burn coal for power, that really increases the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. I was working with the Minnesota Terrestrial Carbon Sequestration Project, which was a group of people from state agencies, non-governmental organizations, and the university looking at this issue. And right now there is a market out there, and actually you can offset, if you were a power plant in the Twin Cities, you could offset your carbon footprint by planting trees in Australia or in Brazil. But one of the things that we said with our work was, if we're going to have people paying for those carbon credits, we'd like that money to come back to Minnesota and be put in the pockets potentially of landowners so they can do a better job of managing their lands. So that's part of what, the work we've been doing has been looking at. How do we get that, if there are these payments, get that money back to landowners so they can manage better and really be paid for their good stewardship. So if we talk about sequestration, we're really talking about the capture and secure storage of that carbon that would otherwise be emitted and stay in the atmosphere and increase those concentrations, as has been pretty well documented. And again, if we look at any growing plant, whether it's trees or crops, they sequester carbon from the atmosphere and then they release it when they decompose. So if we look at trees, while trees are growing, they absorb that CO2 and they emit oxygen, which is another of the functions of trees, one of the things that they help us with. We look at carbon sequestered and stored in trees. As Jeff mentioned, about roughly 50% carbon by dry weight is in those trees. And I guess this is kind of common sense. If those trees are growing faster, some of the hybrid poplars we have, they're going to sequester carbon quicker. So if you have a faster growing tree, that's going to be taking more carbon out of the atmosphere on an annual basis and would then also give you a higher payment for that sequestration. And if we look at new plantings, particularly on what might have been grassland, agricultural land, row crops, they provide a net gain in carbon sequestration. That is, they're actually pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in those trees. And as they grow, they continue to take that out of the atmosphere and store it. At about roughly, the markets are figuring about 2 tons per acre per year. Some trees will get up to 5 tons per acre per year in terms of the amount of carbon they'll take out of the atmosphere. Sometimes the markets discount that for certain reasons. And then if you have a managed forest, you have a carbon stock. You're maintaining that. So actually part of the Waxman-Markey bill includes maintaining forests. So to avoid deforestation and degradation of forest lands, because if you have deforestation, they claim that's about 20% of the carbon emitted into the atmosphere on an annual basis around the world. So that's a huge source of this the carbon that we're trying to keep out of the atmosphere. So it does include payments to maintain managed forests. Also, if you have a well-managed forest, you're probably continually sequestering carbon, and that could qualify a landowner to get credit for that and a payment. So what are carbon credits? They really encompass 2 ideas. One is the prevention, reduction of emissions produced by human activities from reaching the atmosphere by capturing and diverting them to secure storage. There's even talk now about geologic storage. That is, you actually take that carbon out of smokestacks before it gets into the atmosphere, and you pump it down into their surface, into these caverns under the earth. They do this with natural gas already as a way to store natural gas. You could do the same thing with carbon. That's another way to get carbon out of the atmosphere and store it for a long period of time. Or the second one is removal of carbon from the atmosphere by different means and securely storing it. And we talk about terrestrial carbon sequestration, crops, trees, that they're pulling it out and they're securely storing it as long as that tree's alive. Once it dies or starts to deteriorate, it'll release that back into the atmosphere. So again, the credits that are now being traded on the world markets, it's for carbon sequestered and stored for a defined period of time, anywhere from 15 to 100 years. And I think the trend is, we want that stored for a long time, obviously, to keep it out of the atmosphere. So you probably see that 15 years going up. And the forestry credits are for net sequestration. That is, you have a forest, it's a living system that you have some trees that are dying, potentially, being crowded out by competition. They're releasing carbon, or you do a thinning or a harvest, and that's could potentially be releasing the carbon as well. But you also have that growth. So, so really what we're saying is the carbon sequestered through that tree growth, soil storage and other storage, minus the carbon emitted, which mortality, harvest, whatever it might be, that would be the amount of carbon that would qualify for that credit. So it's the amount sequestered, basically. I mean, it's really pretty basic that you're taking what's been sequestered, subtracting what's removed from the system through harvest or tree death, and that would be, again, that amount you get paid for. And the payments are based on the number of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So and we talk about plantations. So actually I was talking to this fellow that works with carbon credits today, and he was saying, you know, if you're getting ready to harvest, that's not a good time to enter the market, because as soon as you harvest, you have a deficit of carbon credits because you've taken those trees out of the system. But if you have a plantation or if you have trees actively growing, they are sequestering carbon, and then you would qualify for the payments. So if you have a plantation that's established on previously cropped land, oops, get rid of that. There's going to be a net increase in the carbon dioxide sequestered because those trees are growing, and they're going to take it out of the air and store it in the wood, in the bark, the roots, and in the soil eventually. And even if you harvest that plantation over a period of time, you're going to have a net gain in the carbon sequestered. Especially if you have a managed forest where you're cutting a little bit each year, you still have that stock that you put in there, and you should deserve a payment for that. So that average net sequestration would then be eligible for the credit. But once that plantation is established, you've kind of arrived at a steady state. It's growing, but you're also harvesting, so you're not really sequestering any additional carbon. But you could get paid for up to that point where it reached that average, and then probably not beyond it. So what's happening in the market? And I think Jeff touched on this. In this country, we have the Chicago Climate Exchange. It's a voluntary market. No one's telling these people that they have to enter into this market. Ford is a member of this. There's several large companies. The university is a member of that market, but it's voluntary. They're not required to do that. The fellow that runs this whole market, he was here a couple of years ago, and somebody asked him, well, why are people getting into this market? And he said fear and greed, basically. He said there's companies that see this carbon regulation coming down the line. They want to get in it and get the credits when they're cheaper, because they see something coming. And some of them do it because stockholders in their companies might even be asking them to do it. Then we have the European Climate Exchange, and that's a regulated market. That's based on the Kyoto Protocol. So there you have companies that have to buy carbon credits if they're emitting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So if you look at prices, and it's really curious right now, the Chicago Climate Exchange started at about $1 a ton. It went up to about $7.50, and right now it's 10 cents a ton. But the reason it's 10 cents a ton right now is because we have the Waxman-Markey bill. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, but everybody's kind of waiting. So right now, people aren't getting into that market. The other thing is that Ford is a member of one of the people that was paying for credits, and with all their shutdown of factories, they don't need very many credits, because they're not emitting as much carbon dioxide, so that's kind of brought that down. But it's largely because people are just kind of waiting, holding their breath until something does happen with the Congress, and we come up with some kind of legislation, cap and trade, whatever it might be. And it looks like something probably will come out of this. But the European Climate Exchange, again, that's a regulated market. They're paying anywhere between $21 and $25 a ton, as opposed to the 10 cents here. So if you're looking at, again, Minnesota condition, a forest that's sequestering 2 to 3 tons per acre per year, you could qualify for a $40 to $60 payment per acre per year for that carbon that your forest sequesters. What is